So this is the introductory lecture to Political Science 312, in which we really are looking at the birth of the modern world as we know it. And many of the fragments that emerged in the 16th century with the Protestant Reformation were at the center of creating the modern, late modern, postmodern world we live in. Some of the principles that were very much set in place, the seeds sown in the soil of time, have continued to grow, and they shape much of late modern, postmodern thought. The culture wars that we live with, they're very much existing in the 16th century, and we just secularize those culture wars, but the way of thinking remains the same, in which people move from uncertain truths very much to certain untruths in their thinking, and this quest to understand what truth is and goodness and beauty, in which there is legitimate uncertainty, but then people often jump to from uncertain truths to certain untruths, and so this transition can lead to serious culture wars and clashes. But the late medieval world was very much a period of time which I mentioned in the last class, in which the Roman Catholic Church in the West, at least, was divided on itself. Some of the great thinkers of the time, I mentioned Thomas Aquinas and Dante, and particularly the tensions between mythos and logos. That will continue as we move into this course, really, between the Romantics and the Rationalists. That doesn't go away in terms of different ways of knowing or different epistemologies. But what emerges in the 16th century, and I finished the last lecture with Erasmus, who points the way in one direction for the West, and then his clash and tensions with Martin Luther points in a very different directions. It became obvious by the end of the late Middle Ages, 15th century, that the Roman Catholic Church, for the most part, was in a state of disarray. The ideals by which the Catholic Church was much to stand for there was a chasm between the ideals and the realities. At both political levels, you had popes like Julius, who were war popes. You had the church itself, priests and deacons and laities, poorly educated. Rome was in a state of great affluence, meanwhile, and war dominated, and meanwhile, and the ideal of Christ as a peacemaker was at the opposite end of that spectrum. And so someone like Martin Luther comes along, but even Erasmus earlier, they see very much there's an inconsistency between the ideals of the form of Christianity in the West and the Holy Roman Empire politically, and what politically and religiously these traditions stood for ideally, and what they had become in reality. And so there was a need for reform, of change, and so people like Erasmus, Thomas More, John Colet were Catholics at the center of critiquing the Roman Catholic Church, but loyal to it. Luther comes along and argues, after again and again attempting to what he thought he could reform the church. The church took the position that Luther did not represent in his critique of it genuine Catholicism, so he was increasingly branded as a heretic, and the more Luther was marginalized by the Roman Catholic Church, the more vociferous he became in critiquing it. And so, but the Erasmus-Luther tradition is very important to understand, because what it does, it reflects two different ways of interpreting ultimate reality and then penultimate reality in the world of politics and economics and other areas of thinking. And so within Erasmus, you get this notion that to be human is to be finite, it's to be fallible. We see through a glass darkly, and so it's an irenical position in which he tries to hear and heed people who differ with him, who see that inevitably he's not going to see perfectly, And this is why he needs others to bring their perspectives, whether it's interpretations of the history of Christianity or the Bible itself. There is a history, what we call polyphony, in which there's different ways of approaching an understanding of ultimate reality as it plays itself out in penultimate and anti-penultimate issues. And so within this polyphonic tradition, theologically, exegetically, politically, economically, this irenical polyphonic tradition is one which attempts to bring people together in a conciliar manner to move forward in history in a meaningful way. The Lutheran tradition took the position that he knew how to interpret the Bible, particularly texts, Romans, Galatians, how to interpret the church mothers and fathers, and it was a monophonic tradition in which he and those who followed him knew the truth of Christianity, of reality itself, and those who differed with him were of the devil, and they had to be marginalized. And so the eventual clashes between Luther and Calvin represents two epistemologies, one which there's place for ambiguity, uncertainty, polyphony, irenical approach, the other which is about certainty, monophonic or one voice that leads to confrontation. And so between these two ways of knowing, two paths are taken culturally. And so what, of course, then happens as the Lutheran position comes to dominate, Luther breaks from the Roman Catholic Church because he feels the Roman Catholic Church cannot be reformed. And so this Gnostic position, Gnostic meaning gnosis in Greek, but a form of knowing that gnosis equals certainty. We are the ones who know, and if those who don't agree with us, that proves they don't know. And so what inevitably happens, though, with Luther sowing the seeds of a Gnostic approach or a monophonic approach to interpreting the tradition, then the next generation that follows him is the Reformed tradition, or the Calvinist tradition, in which they argued that Luther's read of the Bible was problematic, or of the church tradition, and they had the true read. So then the question is, who has the true read of a text? If one accepts a monophonic approach, there only is one truth, like mathematics, 2 and 2 equals 4, 4 and 4 equals 8, or an empirical understanding of flower is either red or it's not red. If someone says a red flower is pink, you say perhaps the site is problematic. If you hit something that's hard and someone says it's soft, well, there's something wrong, obviously, in terms of how they understand things. So this monophonic, empirical, certain scientific way of knowing that was to have an impact on 16th century theology and exegesis, there's two directions that could be taken. And so I mentioned then the Lutheran tradition spills over into the Calvinist tradition coming out of Switzerland and Geneva. Then the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition differed with the Lutherans and the Reformed or Calvinist. Now what underlies all of these ways of seeing is they all share the tendency to Gnostic tendency to assume their understanding of the Bible, the tradition, is the true one. But they can't agree on whose certainty is the most certain. And this is where you get the rise then in the 16th century of denominations and back of those confessions. And those confessions reflect the certainty of the Lutheran, the Reformed, the Anabaptist Mennonite traditions. Then the Roman Catholic tradition reacted to the various Protestant confessions with the Council of Trent, with its certainty. And so you have these movements of the 16th century, each claiming to have certain truths, in this case about theology and religion, how the Bible is to be interpreted, which Bible is the most authentic, but none of them can agree with the different groups and what that is, versus the Erasmian tradition, which took the position, be wary of this Gnostic certainty, in which each group will assume that their interpretation of reality is the right, true, and good one, and if they're differed with, then that must be the person who doesn't see things properly, doesn't intellectually understand things the best way. And so these two paths taken in the 16th century really are paths forward, which is going to define Western civilization. Obviously, at this period of time, what's occurring is the fragmentation of Christendom or Christianity into multiple denominations. So Christendom or Christianity is beginning to fragment. There's no center that holds it together anymore. The Holy Roman Empire is fragmenting increasingly into nation states as well. So this is the period of time of the nation states rather than the Holy Roman Empire, and this is where we've inherited nation states, and then the Peace of Westphalia, which comes a little later as a result of warring states. This is also a period of time which is very important, the rise of science. This is a period of time of Galileo and Copernicus, and the argument that science, through astronomy, through medicine, through an empirical way of knowing, can provide sure and solid, clear and distinct ideas philosophically or empirically that gives solid results in the material world, unlike theology and religion, which is about quality and speculation, which can't be proved or disproved via an empirical means. Science delivers the hard goods, and through its method, these goods can be supplied to society through medicine, through understanding how the galaxies and the stars work. So science increasingly, as religion fragments, turns on one another, science emerges as religion vacates the throne. And increasingly so, the method that science uses that brings objective truths, solid, hard facts, comes as a critique of forms of religion which can't perform at that level. So people come to trust science more and more, both in its theoretical approach and its practical application in comparison to religion itself. And this is where you begin to get the clash, particularly the treatment of Copernicus and Galileo, not so much Newton in England, in which the English tradition was a little softer and more appreciative of science than elements of the Roman Catholic tradition itself. And so this period of time is also what's coming to be is the rise of science and the subordinating of religion as a way of understanding who should be the dominant voice, the authorial voice, and the role of reason and logic is coming to take the central stage in terms of who can be trusted and who cannot be trusted. This is also a 16th century. Luther, Calvin, Anabaptist, they're appealing to certain, even though sola scriptura or the Bible is seen as the formal source of authority at this period of time, the deeper source of authority was the right of the individual, all being equal in good conscience, to interpret either the Bible or their tradition as they saw fit. So this is where liberalism or the modern world emerges. Some people will argue it as the Enlightenment that plays the significant role in midwifing the liberal modern tradition. In fact, the Reformation is the origin of liberalism. And so we're going to be exploring a little bit of that in this course, how as we go through different phases of and acts and scenes of the liberal drama, how the role the Reformation played in that process, which is very, very significant, and how some of the culture wars we face today between, say, social justice warriors and progressives and conservatives, they don't differ on many of these principles of liberalism, the right of the individual in good conscience, all being equal to exercise their rights as they see fit. They just differ on how far you're going to move that content along in the journey. And the culture clashes are really just secularized 16th century clashes. They're really just Luther secularized. Because in Luther, as in Calvin, as in many of the confessions, if one disagreed with one group, then that just proved they were wrong, or they were unjust, or they were deliberately blind, or they were repressing that which is good. It was a simple black and white Manichaean Gnostic way, almost a comic book way of seeing reality in the 16th century. And we can see in certain of the intense culture wars that are with us today, there's that simple, yet once again, Gnostic and Manichaean dualism. One side is right and the other side is wrong. Sometimes it's made it appear as if the cultural Marxism or 19th century economic Marxism, with its simple division between proletariat and bourgeois, initiates a simplistic powerlessness, one overcoming the other, or cultural Marxism. But in fact, these simple dualisms of powerlessness, you just have to go back to the 16th century. It's the same epistemological dualism at work, and it actually goes much earlier, but we'll be exploring more that way, that epistemology that reduces reality to simple categories. One group is right, the other's wrong. One is light, one is darkness. One is oppressed, the other is the oppressor. One does not have to read too far in Luther or Calvin or the Anabaptist or the Treaty of Trent Catholics to see how this way of thinking continues with us today. It's a Gnostic epistemology. Now, someone like an Erasmus would very much come along, as he did in the 16th century, and in these culture clashes, suggest to both sides that they put their pistols in their holsters and recognize that both the history of interpretation and the history of contemporary issues is much more layered and complex and ambiguous than is often articulated. Now, of course, when someone comes across like that, you're seen as a fence sitter, accused of that, or siding with the powerful. And that's an ad hominem argument, which is a way of dismissing more thoughtful people from the public discussion itself. And so, just as Erasmus felt the ire of the Protestants and of the Catholics in his age for refusing to ideologically goose-step at any of their positions, he argued that partisan politics inevitably shrunk reality to an ideological Procrustean bed. So the same thing happens today to often the Erasmians, who don't uncritically buy into the tribalism or the clannishness of the reactionary right or the progressive left. And so in that sense, the 16th century is an amazing test site for where we are today in terms of the origins of liberalism, how people interpret reality in terms of war, peace, justice, injustice, simplistic ways of reducing reality to formulas and cliches in that sense. And so our journey from the 16th century will go really from Erasmus up to George Grant. We're going to finish with the important Canadian George Grant, because one of the dilemmas, as I mentioned in the first part of this course, particularly the intellectual political tradition from the classics up to Erasmus, is memoricide is one of the besetting illnesses of our time. People have no memory, no history, and this then leads to an inability to understand how the past has been where we are, and it can offer us a variety of options in terms of dealing with clashes and tensions in the culture wars, and where the consequences are of making certain decisions, where the path leads, the cul-de-sac it ends at if you continue down a certain path. So in this course we'll then move Erasmus. Obviously we're going to factor Machiavelli in, and we'll move up through Smith and Burke and Hume and Locke. Marx obviously will be very important as left-wing, a form of left-wing liberalism. We'll look at right-wing liberalism. We'll look at a variety of further political positions on the left and then the right. And then we'll end with Grant, high Toryism, to get a sense of a political position that is neither simplistically liberal nor reactionary conservative, but an intellectual outlook that transcends, yet once again, simplistic ways of understanding things. So hopefully, as we come to the end of this course, memoricide will be minimally overcome through reflecting on significant issues, the past, what the past speaks to us today, and if the past listens, or the past informs the present, how the present can be wiser and more insightful in how we deal with conflictual issues that divide the progressives, the left, from the reactionary right, and plot a way forward which is much more in the spirit of irenical Erasmus and Hugo Grotius and many who followed in that line and lineage and family tree, that begs to differ with those who want to simplistically reduce reality to one tribe or the other.